There is a park behind where I live that I take my morning walks. I enjoy seeing the dogs run full throttle across the field. These days, I live vicariously through the freedom of dogs at full sprint. I enjoy their exuberance in a world unaffected by COVID. I've been feeling cramped. I'm beginning to consider how to get air with a long-term shelter in place and what it all can mean. The worries begin to pile up. How do we sustain community with church being online for so long? How do I do pastoral care with distance as the new normal? How will I consider what Eucharist means for our congregation and what will be the restrictions that we have from the diocese and the national church? I think also about living with housemates. Each of us have our own level of comfort and discomfort about sheltering in place. Some of us are more conservative and aren't going out and being in contact with anyone outside of the pod. And others of us are kind of tired of the pod and want to see friends and are beginning to socialize and go out and be in common space together. So I wonder how this will affect the way I can take care of my father, who seems to have a threat of cancer returning. And I wonder, when will we get a chance to bury my mother? The list goes on. I'm feeling cramped. There's a story, Martin Laird, who is a professor of Christian origins and is a practicing contemplative, that he tells about some dogs that he was watching on his walk. He noticed that an owner had 4 dogs, and 3 of the dogs were running across the field, enjoying the freedom that they had. But the 4th dog was running in circles, in tight little circles. And he asked the owner, why does this 4th dog just run in tight circles when there's a whole field out there? And the owner explained that when the dog was young, he was trapped in a cage. And in order to get any exercise, he would have to run inside the cage in tight circles. And even though he was no longer in the cage, he still lived like he was in the cage. These days, so many of us might feel like we live in a tight cage with all the crises that our nation and our world are facing. And now in the 4th month of sheltering in place, and Governor Gavin Newsom has pulled back some of the reentry, I can sense from within myself and with talking to other people that we're hitting another emotional dip along the curve of emotional responses to the pandemic. We will act out, tired of this, angry of this, depressed by this. We need air. We need rest. We need rest for our souls. As of right on time, Jesus tells us this week, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. He is saying this to his disciples and to the crowds. For chapters now, chapters and chapters, He's been teaching his disciples and the crowds what is the nature of the kingdom of heaven. What is the reign of heaven? People are beginning to realize it isn't as easy as it first might have sounded. He tells them that they have to expect trials and tribulations, persecution, and even death. Chapter after chapter. Rabbi Jesus, perhaps sensing the awkward silence, perhaps taking his eyes off his notes, might have seen that everyone is now staring at the ground. This is a bit too much for us, we earthen vessels. And so he looks at the disciples and the crowds and has compassion on them. And he says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Normally, we think of yokes as what oxen wear around their necks so that the farmers can pull them along to plow the fields. But it was also used as a metaphor for the study and love of the Torah. Particularly when you take the yoke or the mantle or the stole of a certain rabbi, you follow in their school of teaching and dedicate your ways to wisdom. Jesus is inviting his audience, including us, to take his yoke and his teachings. They lead to rest for the soul. These teachings first began with all those lovely beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount. And that was the honeymoon period. Now they need to live into the reign of heaven for the long haul. And now they need wisdom. Wisdom is an important part of the Jewish tradition. When Jesus says, "Come to me," Jesus is speaking in a formula of wisdom. Wisdom is personified as often speaking. For example, Proverbs has wisdom saying, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight." In chapter 11 of Matthew, which we read today, Jesus says that wisdom is vindicated by her deeds. These deeds, according to Professor Jennifer Cowland of Iona College, is to provide order out of chaos, to have humility, and wisdom grants us these things to protect us and guard us. Wisdom is a life-giving gift that comes from the Lord's favor. All this is shown in our Old Testament. So what does the Torah teach that gives rest for the soul? One of the most important teachings is on the Sabbath. Sadly, the lectionary cuts out chapter 12 of Matthew, which has two stories about the Sabbath that follow right on this story. In these stories, Jesus talks about the true nature of the Sabbath, that they are for nourishment and for healing. The Sabbath is not about how closely we can exercise the letter of the law. Humanity needs nourishment and healing to find rest for our souls. Ever since I encountered Abraham Heschel's book called Sabbath, my view of the Sabbath has been immensely enriched. Heschel says that we spend 6 days a week laboring, and we think we are what we do and what we produce. And we live as if those 6 days define who we are. And we get confused. But on the 7th day, we abstain from labor to remember that we are not what we produce, and we are not even our appetites, what we want, what we see other people have, and then suddenly we want it. On the 7th day, we remember who we actually are, which is creatures. We are creatures of the Creator. Therefore, God is our master, and we are not mastered by these things that happen in the 6 days. Now, we sometimes think we are our own masters, but the scriptures tell us that we cannot serve God and mammon. And God is the master, or mammon is the master, those 6 days. And so on the 7th day, when we remember that we are creatures and not God, that is when we can get rest from our appetites, our worries, and all that those 6 days make us think is real. And so Heschel says, I think it's very lovely, Sabbath is last in creation, but first in intention. The intention of our creation is to know that we are created by God, and therefore God is our master. So holy rest is not a Mai Tai on the beach. That is not the rest for the soul. Your body might enjoy it, and it has its place. But the rest of the soul is really about knowing to whom we belong. And so when we claim Jesus through our Christ, through God, as the one who defines who we are, then we no longer spin round and round in the cage of our minds. So, you know, these long days ahead of us, who knows how long they will be, we need to practice Sabbath, this deep rest that we can only find in God. And the world can look like it belongs to the politicians, to money, to even violence. And we can give ourselves over to those things thinking they are all that is around us. And then we get hooked. And we need to get unhooked by these things and remember who's really in charge. And this is hard to see. We have to practice actually unseeing these kinds of things that we think are real, that the world is going to hell and in handbasket, those kinds of things. And we need to see the way that God sees, the way that the rest, being rested, sees. So I know I've done this before with you, but I really encourage you to practice centering prayer. This is a kind of practice that I believe helps cultivate resting for the soul. It is about quieting our reactivity to the world. Those 6 days, we think we are our thoughts, and we think we are our feelings. But centering prayer says that those are not who we really are. Who we really are is who we are in God. So I want to lead us in a little bit of centering prayer to end this sermon, so that we can get a practice of lowering our reactivity to those things that the 6 days of creation begins to kind of confuse us with, all that draws us out of that rest in God. So, something that centering prayer is not is that it doesn't stop thoughts and feelings. That's just part of being human. But what we practice is not getting hooked by them and just letting them pass. So don't be bothered if you find yourself thinking and feeling. That's fine, but just let it pass. And the way we let it pass in centering prayer is choosing a sacred word. So when we notice that we're beginning to make our grocery list or wonder what's for dinner, we say the sacred word and then let the thought go, and as many times as we need to. So I usually use the sacred word of Jesus. You can use whatever word you would like, but if you don't have a word or you don't want to think about it, Jesus is a very ancient prayer, and I commend that to you as an option. So why don't you sit deeply into your seat and feel supported by it, and notice places of tension in your body, like maybe your forehead, maybe your eyebrows, your jaw, back of your neck, your shoulders. And take a deep belly breath from that place and see if you can relax all the places of tension in your body. And do that 3 times. Just take a breath from your belly. And now bring to mind the prayer word. And let's just sit in some silence. Let's just sit here for 2 minutes. Usually it's a practice of 20 minutes. And if you want to practice some more with us, we meet on Tuesday evenings. So just breathe gently. And as thoughts become conscious to you, take a little breath and say your prayer word and release it. And we'll be here for 2 minutes. Take a couple of deep breaths again to arrive back. I usually like to end my centering prayer time with a prayer by Meister Eckhart. Let us pray. The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. Amen. I commend this kind of prayer to you. May you find rest for your souls. Amen.